Good afternoon. This is CIVE 638, Sedimentation Engineering, and this is our class 051. Today the subject is more on sediment production, particularly production from watersheds. We're in the syllabus here. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about this project, baseflow augmentation by stream bank storage, and I want you to as you see fit. I'm not going to quiz you on it, but I would like you, it's an important project, an important report. So, but it's a long report. I do realize there's a lot of stuff in here. It's about an 150-page report. However, I have set it up as presentation, and I'm going to be looking at a few things that I want to emphasize on the presentation. First, let me give you a little bit of background as to how this project how did it get started. I mentioned to you back in 1989, Pacific Gas and Electric put an RFP for baseflow studies, and I applied thinking that I was going to compete with other people, and I belated to realize that I was the only person that applied, so I got the job. Thank God, because this job allowed me to become much broader person, because until 1989 I had done only computational hydraulics, and I had only done routing of floods. Flood routing was my expertise since the early 70s until 1989, for almost 15 years. And then all of a sudden I got this project, and that allowed me to get into baseflow. And I think, as you guys know, or I may have said this before, that baseflow is the opposite of floods. So this was the other side of the coin. So I was very happy that I was finally able to diversify in the various subjects that I was teaching. And the reason for that is because I felt that routing was fine, but I needed to learn a little more about many other things that were out there to be learned. So I got this job, and in a year or two, I think it was 2 years, we put together this huge report which has everything that was written up to that time on baseflow. So we put together this huge report on baseflow, and this is the report. This is the final product of that research. How does this relate to sediment? Well, because when you conserve baseflow, sediment load into the stream decreases, and this is what I'm going to be talking about here today. So now one of the issues is the issue of name. Look at this report. It's called Baseflow Augmentation by Stream Bank Storage. I believe the person that handed this project from PG&E, she was concerned about stream bank storage, which is related to the stream bank storage of water is related to baseflow. So she put together the name Baseflow Augmentation by Stream Bank Storage, and of course we had to follow what she said. So this was the title of the project. But since then I have become a little bit more knowledgeable on this subject, and I do believe now that baseflow is important. And second, we can lose baseflow by doing all sorts of things to the environment, and that would be, in general, it's a bad thing to lose baseflow, because when you lose baseflow, you augment floods. It's the two sides of the coin, and therefore I believe now that baseflow is important. It has to be conserved for the betterment of society, and of course the baseflow is stored in the stream bank, and furthermore, beyond the stream bank. So it's not just stream bank. So this report was a little bit focused on something very narrow, but it should be understood that it brings up the subject of baseflow to the forefront. And I've been recognized by many people for doing that precisely in the 1989, 1990, bringing out baseflow. I do recall when we started this project, the ratio of baseflow projects or baseflow papers to flood papers was about 1 in 100 or even less. And what is the reason for that? Because society does not spend a whole lot of money on baseflow. the money is spent on floods because people complain about the floods and so forth. Very few people have complained about baseflow. However, the loss of baseflow could cause a lot of damage. Typically, it's not damage in the cities, so the political issues are somewhat different. There's rural areas, and people in the rural areas can complain about the loss of baseflow, as we will see in the various stories that I will tell you, hopefully get to tell you today. Okay, in here, unless specifically stated otherwise, this report, stream bank storage, will be used to refer to floodplain, stream side, stream bank, and stream bottom storage of water for later release when it can be released. And you know, water in the environment, it moves only by a gradient, following a hydraulic gradient. You have to have a hydraulic gradient in order to move water. Otherwise, water gets stuck, and then if it gets stuck in a shallow puddle or a lake, it evaporates and it's gone. But water is always moving. Flow is always moving underground. Okay, the importance of stream bank storage and its effect on stream hydrology, ecology, and geomorphology is now becoming increasingly apparent to a broad spectrum of scientists and professionals, including biologists, ecologists, hydrologists, hydraulic and environmental engineers, and natural resource managers. Among the perceived benefits of baseflow are these. 1, increase in the magnitude and duration of low flows to benefit diverse downstream users. Low flows are important because they maintain also good sediment transport, or reasonable amounts of sediment transport. Maintenance of in-stream flows and water temperatures necessary for the sustenance of adequate and diverse fish populations. Development of moist, year-round environment suitable for the establishment and growth of riparian vegetation. And here came about the issue of riparian vegetation. I think I did mention to you that when I met Wayne Elmore, when I visited the Camp Creek project, he told me at the time that he had been recently given the title of riparian specialist. And he was the only riparian specialist in the entire Bureau of Land Management, which meant obviously that the specialty of riparian scientist was new at the time, and this was 1989. Riparian vegetation, why is it good? Because it can be related to increased channel and bank stability. If riparian vegetation is lost, stability is gone, bank stability in the channel is gone, and consequently sediment erosion increases. So in here we have the latter can be related to increased channel and bank stability, decreased erosion and sediment transport, improved water quality, enhanced wildlife habitats, additional stream shading, lower stream temperatures, and improved stream aesthetics, meaning the way the stream looks. And that's also very important. Aesthetic has become very important in the last 30 years. Prior to 1990s, pretty much nobody was talking about aesthetics. We all were talking about functionality, but not necessarily aesthetics. Nowadays, we put more emphasis into this particular aspect. Thus, the benefits of this work are many and varied, and it cuts across several knowledge areas. As a matter of fact, the person that gave me this contract was a range manager. And it was the first time that I got out of my little box, the title, or gave me the title of hydraulic engineer or hydrologist. And I started looking at other sources of knowledge. Let me also say at this point, because it's important, that up to 1989, I used to read 3 journals, 3 of my specialty journals. Most of them American Society of Civil Engineers. I also read Geophysical Union, American Geophysical Union. Right at that time, there was a watershed in my pursuit of knowledge. And I started to read other journals. I began with the related journals. And eventually, I got to read just about everything. That obviously is good and bad. It's good because it gives you more breadth of knowledge. It is also bad because you're no longer pursuing a single specialty. And you know how it is. The more you know about broader things, the less you know about one specific specialty. But that's what I wanted to do. It is a question of personality and the way you want to do your career. So I decided that to become broad, even at the cost of not becoming, or rather not becoming too deep in my own field of knowledge, which was flood routing from the beginning. Okay, I wrote in 1977, I wrote that paper that those of you that have taken computational hydraulics have already heard me talk about. I call it the S-curve, although it was not the S-curve because it's an S-curve what comes out of the paper, but in reality is an analytical study of wave propagation. It is 100% hydraulics. And that's what I had studied to do. But then later I became interested in other areas of which I'm going to talk about today. Look, I realized at the time that I was getting into a huge area where there's all kinds of related fields. So I'm going to be listing those fields for you today so that you can imagine or realize the extent to the path that we were taking at the time. Surface water hydrology, of course, basic, that's our origin. Groundwater hydrology and hydraulics. Hydrogeology, which is related to groundwater. Stream hydraulics and stream mechanics. We have talked about stream mechanics already. Very important part of this class is stream mechanics. Water quality, yes, because water quality is not only related to the stuff that stinks, but also to the sediment. If the water is full of sediment, then the quality is very low. So also related, what we're talking about here related to water quality hydrology. Fluvial geomorphology, that's the geomorphology of the streams. Very important to understand rivers. You cannot understand rivers without having a good knowledge of fluvial geomorphology. Riparian botany. Botany? What is that? Engineers don't study botany, or particularly civil engineers. No, not engineers. All engineers don't study botany, but we had to get into botany. I had become acutely aware of botany in the study that I did in the Pantanal of Mato Grosso in 1979, 1980, because I realized that botany was intrinsically related to hydrology. Up to that time, I didn't know. I couldn't care because I was not a botanist. But I realized at the time that there was a lot of things out there, and I could tell you a lot of stories, but I'm not going to do it right now, about the relation between hydrology and botany. So then 10 years later, I began to respect the issues of botany and riparian biology, which is related to riparian botany too. Stream ecology. What is ecology? Ecology is the study of ecosystems. It is a field of biology. Why is it a field of biology? Biology is the study of life. Ecology is the study of everything. So how is it that there's a confusion between what ecology deals with and and biology deals with? And the answer is very simple. Ecology has always been, from the beginning of this field, considered part of biology, even though it goes beyond biology, much beyond biology. Why is that? Because biology considers only the biology of things, while ecology considers the biology, the physics, and the chemistry. So ecology as a field is 3 times more complex than biology. And yet, if you look for an ecologist out there, he or she is a biologist. You don't find engineers doing ecology as a profession. How did this happen? I don't know. All I can say is that that's a fait accompli. That's the way it works. Here at San Diego State, the Department of Ecology is within biology. But we should respect ecology because ecology is the study of just about everything that sits on the surface of the earth. Perhaps it doesn't go to space, but at that point it doesn't really matter. Fisheries biology. Fisheries is very important. We need to understand and respect. Engineers, of course, from our own, because of our own limited training, we hardly have any knowledge of fisheries. Example, a case in point, the Army Corps of Engineers in the 30s and 40s and 50s last century. They were given the job of damming the Columbia, and they went ahead and did that. So many dams out there in the Columbia River. I don't know how many, but at least 10, if not 20. huge dams. Bonneville is one of the largest dams out there in the Columbia. They, of course, forgot or could not care less, excuse me for saying that, but it needs to be said, that there were fish in the river. They just totally ignored that that was a large river and it had fish. And they put these barriers, these dams to hold the water for the generation of electricity and so forth, hydropower and so forth. 30 years later, 40 years later, they were made aware that this was wrong. So they went ahead and tried to fix it, and they did try to fix it. They fixed it. They fixed it with the so-called ladders. So nowadays, the dams in the Columbia are equipped, or I guess you could say retrofitted, with ladders so that the fish can go up the dam all the way to the other side, the upstream side of the dam. I have a video on this, and I'm going to put it out for you guys to take a look at. Watershed management, very important. Only recently, the last 20, 30 years, has it become important. Watershed management is management of the watershed. It involves just about everything. But the watershed management professionals are typically within the field of range science, range management. I don't know why, because watershed is not range. There are 4 biomes. There's forest, range, agriculture, and urban. And the last 2, agriculture and urban, are anthropogenic. There's also deserts out there, but we're not counting them because they hardly have any vegetation. But there's more biomes than the 4 that I have listed. The 4 that I listed are for purposes of study and management. Actually, I take that back. Deserts can also be managed and should be managed. Natural resources management, yes, because what are the natural resources? The natural resources are actually, there's as many as you can think of. But the natural resources that we could manage, let me tell you a story on this. In 1935, the federal government decided to institute the Soil Conservation Service. Soil Conservation Service. They're going to conserve the soil. Why they do that at that time? And the answer was because they had had the bad experience of the Dust Bowl in the middle of the country, in the middle of the country, in the prairie, which had been mismanaged for many years. Abused is the word. And therefore they decided to do something about it. They put their best minds to thinking about how to solve this problem. And they came up with, one of the ideas they came up with is that they should create a federal agency that will take care of studying and then solving, helping societies solve the problems of their soil, the management of their soil. You cannot manage soil without managing water. So they should have given these guys the name of Soil and Water Conservation Service. That should have been the case, but that was not the case. For various purposes that are mostly political, and I really don't want to care, I don't care to get into that at this point. But the point is that what happened was that they called them Soil Conservation Service, 1935, 1936. And they went into business, and one of the first things they did, they wrote a very illuminating report, which was published in 1940, which we are going to hopefully get to cover today if we get to cover it. Otherwise, we'll cover it Wednesday in detail. The 1940 famous report of the first report. They call it a first report on research of the Soil Conservation Service, dated 1940. But let's fast forward a few years, not a few years, 6 decades. In the middle 90s, with all this environmental movement coming up and being thrown at us, and all of us, we all realized that there was the environment out there and that we weren't doing enough to help manage it. So that the federal government came up with the idea that they should come up with biological service. Yes. But that somehow politically did not fly. And eventually they canceled the development of the biological service, and they charged the Soil Conservation Service, which is an agency which had a big reputation at the time, with doing not only the soils, but also the natural resources. That's the way they saw the problem. They said, we can't create another agency. I don't know, I wasn't in there in the decisions, But all I know is that in the final analysis, the Soil Conservation Service was given an expanded view of what they had to do. Prior to 1995, they were doing soil and water. After 1995, they were doing other natural resources. Specifically, which natural resources? Soil, water, what are the others? Nutrients. Nutrients and flora and fauna. Because prior to that, there was nobody from the federal government in charge of the flora and fauna. So these 5 resources were considered within the purview of what the new agency, or recently renamed agency, Natural Resources Conservation Service. And you guys know that now the Soil Conservation Service runoff curve number has now become Natural Resources Service. There's no Soil Conservation Service anymore. It was a great agency. I worked a lot with them in the 80s and in the 90s. I had several friends. We went to school with several people, employees of the Soil Conservation Service. I can tell you stories, many stories in relation to that experience. Next, public land management, forest and range hydrology, right? Forest and range hydrology. Forest is something that is an interesting biome because humans, we technically don't like the forest too much. Meaning we in general. I'm not going to say that there's not forests up in Northern California and there's some people living out there, but there's only 20,000. Right over here in the south where there are no forests, there's 2 million or 3 million. So the majority of the people prefer to stay away from the forests. A case in point, the Amazon rainforest is a huge place and it is largely unpopulated. Range is in the middle. Range is in the middle between forest and agriculture. The canopy. For forests, the canopy could go up to several meters. Like the height of the trees in the Amazon is 60 meters. That's the height of the canopy, the top of the canopy in the Amazon rainforest. Up in Northern California is 80 meters. Are we saying that the trees in Northern California are bigger than those of the Amazon? And the answer is yes, about 20 meters higher. Why? Because there's more water up in Northern California. Northern California rains about 5,000 millimeters, and in the Amazon it rains only 3,000. We all know that the amount of biota, or rather vegetative matter, is a function of the amount of water. If we don't believe that, we just go to a desert. We can go to the coast of Peru. Peru, from the north to south, is just a total and complete desert where it never rains. Those are the driest deserts in the world, some of the driest deserts in the world. Water supply, yes, we need water, obviously. I think I already mentioned to you, if not in the other class, that the current quota is 200 gallons per person per day. The water agencies are in charge of supplying that amount of water on a long term, 5, 10, 20, 15 years, 20 years. Why? Because if we run short, it would take at least 5 years to fix it, to create another reservoir, come up with some water. And you know, water is coming up in there's limited water right now. Why? Because the population continues to increase while the water supply remains more or less the same. We don't really know if the water supply is going to increase or decrease with the onset of global warming. What we know is that global warming is going to produce a lot of changes in the water availability. Hydropower, very important. Why is hydropower important? Because it is clean, for one thing. It does not put any carbon dioxide in the air. So could we go hydropower? And the answer is technically yes and no. We could, but that would mean that we would have to, quote unquote, ruin our rivers. We have messed with a few rivers like the Columbia, but we have been unable as a society to, let's say, affect power plants in all our rivers. We could, but we haven't done it because there's opposition to it. There's people that don't like the hydropower. They like the water and the energy, but they don't like the generation of the hydropower. That's just the way we have a tendency to be. Surface water law, yes, law gets important in there. Law is everything, you know, in groundwater law. Interesting, the groundwater law, surface water law is very complex and very comprehensive, particularly in the Western United States. Every iota of water that it runs on the surface has already an owner in the western United States, because there is scarcity. Groundwater, we don't know about what to do about groundwater. The state of California, in their wisdom over the last 10 years, has given themselves 40 years to solve the problem of regulation of groundwater. If we do not regulate the groundwater, we're going to lose it. Right now, 45% of the state of 45% of the water used by the state of California is groundwater, and 55% surface water. What's the problem, or what's the difference? The problem is that groundwater is not replenishable. Surface water is. So I personally would like to see that figure as 90-10. In other words, 90% surface water and 10% groundwater. And that will mean that if the groundwater gets exhausted, we still have the 90%. But at this point, if the groundwater gets exhausted, we still have the 55%, and that wouldn't be very good. Now, could the groundwater get exhausted? The answer is yes, but it will take some time. The time is measured in maybe a generation or two, and I'm just roughly calculating that. A case in point, the Central Valley. Is the Central Valley pumping groundwater? The answer is yes, a whole lot. Is it depleting the groundwater? The answer is yes. Not a whole lot. It's depleting. The people from the University of California, Davis, had done this study several years ago. I believe that the number is 3 centimeters per year. So 3 centimeters per year is 3 meters per 100 years. And that appears not to be a whole lot. But think about it. The Central Valley of California is huge. Is huge, and I'm going to have a chance to talk about that in more detail, is how it was generated later on. We'll get there before we finish this chapter. Okay, so let's move on. As you can see, very comprehensive and covers just about every aspect of human endeavor. Now, the hydrologic aspects, I would like you to read this stuff in more detail. I'm not going to go over it directly. I already covered in hydrology, at least I've covered some of these subjects over here. I do want to say that I am, as I told you, very lucky gentleman. And when I did this study, I ran into this equation over here. And this is not quite sedimentation, but it's related. It's related. Everything that we're talking here is related. I already told you there's 15 subjects that are all related. But when I was doing this work, I ran into the Cooper and Rorabaugh formula, which was hidden somewhere out there. Hidden, I mean, not people don't mention it, but it is a very important formula because it's the first formula that came out with a comprehensive way, very scientific, mechanistic way of looking at diffusion and from baseflow, rather from underground storage of water, and came up with the recession constant. In other words, in order to study baseflow, you have to look at a recession constant and how to calculate the recession constant, where this formula 2 gave us an idea, or rather it gave us a physical way of doing it. And by the way, this formula has not been superseded or modified in any way. It was developed by Cooper and Rorabaugh in 1963, and how many years have gone by? Almost 60 years, and it's still there. We have used this formula extensively in our papers and reports. Since in 1989, I discovered this formula. There's a lot of stuff in the literature, but you have to discover it. Vegetative aspects, yes, I learned a lot about vegetation. I am not going to say that I am a biologist or an ecologist. I am not. I happen to call myself eco-hydrologist, meaning I'm a hydrologist that knows about ecology. Not a lot of people can say that. It is a growing field in the last 10, 20 years, and there's several books on eco-hydrology, by the way, by now. Some of them unreadable, meaning too difficult, mathematically too difficult. But so be it, or be that as it may, as they say, the vegetative aspects are something that we as engineers cannot forego or ignore. The first gentleman that came up with a connection between hydrology and ecology and the vegetative aspects was a gentleman by the name of Mainzer. He's quoted over here. Mainzer, 1927. That is a paper that we in environmental hydrology we have read. It's a fundamental and very fascinating paper about the relationship between plants and water. And I urge those of you that are interested in this subject to take a look at it if you have not taken environmental hydrology. If you're planning to take environmental hydrology, unfortunately, I have to tell you that it's not going to be with Professor Ponce, because Professor Ponce is retiring at the end of this year. But Meinzer is a must-read among the maybe 20 or 30 papers that I would consider a must-read for us to get an education in many of these subjects. Irrigation return flow, artificial recharge, and the Camp Creek experience. And I am going to briefly describe the Camp Creek experience. I will not get into the other three of them. There's the Sheep Creek Barrier Dam, the Alkali Creek. They're all related, not related. They're similar projects, okay? The Trout Creek Watershed Rehab Project, fascinating. But I'm just going to, because of the passage of time or the issue of time, I'm going to retell the Camp Creek experience, and then we move on to some of the subjects. The experience of Camp Creek is widely regarded as a classic example of successful baseflow augmentation. When I Googled, or not Googled, I shouldn't say that. Google was not around at that time. When I looked in the library, I remember myself and a couple of my students went to the library all summer, 1969. 3 months, we were hiding in the library, in the San Diego State Library, that nowadays is empty because they put everything on the web. But at the time, it was full of people. And we researched baseflow augmentation, and about the few references that one of the few references that we could identify was the Elmore and Bedstadt paper, 1987, and Barber, 1988, I'm sorry. And so this is about Camp Creek, which I have already shown you the pictures. You have seen Camp Creek in raster form already. So what happened was that before extensive settlement, the area drained by Camp Creek was a grassy wetland. Extensive settlement, what do you mean? Well, meaning the settlement of Oregon that happened around the 1880s, featuring predominantly grassy vegetation and a shallow water table. The grassy vegetation encouraged soil infiltrability and made possible an effective aquifer replenishment. Around the turn of the century, that was in the 1900s, overgrazing of the meadow. Now, overgrazing is a word that is not very common in usage, but overgrazing means to graze. Graze is to put animals on the range. Overgrazing is to put too many animals. The range scientists realized that there's a certain load of animals that you can put on any range, and that's what they study. They come around with calculations of maybe you can put maybe 4 heads of cattle in this particular acre or hectare, but if you put 5 or 6 or 8, then you do yourself a disservice, because eventually the too many cattle will trample, or too many animals, cattle, any animal will trample the soil, and then you will lose it. Eventually you will lose it. It will take some time, maybe 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, but you will lose it. It is a negative situation. Much similar to what happened in the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma, by the way, in the 1930s. That was afterwards. We didn't know. Society did not know. We didn't have the scientists of the Soil Conservation Service to study this whole thing. Remember, the people in the Soil Conservation Service were given the job of study, and 4 years later, they came up with this report that I'm talking about, and we're going to read. So it takes time. In the meantime, what happened was that after 10-year drought, nature came back to its senses, I guess you could put it that way. But 10 years of drought, that had never happened in the United States. We have a paper that studies droughts, and it says something like this. It says that the longer, or I guess you could say the more persistent droughts happen in Idaho and surroundings, and they go 5 to 6 years. And yet in Oklahoma in the 1930s, we had a 10-year drought. But that was anthropogenic. It was human-induced. People the people out there were wondering when was the drought going to go, because usually droughts have a way of disappearing eventually. But the question is, when is the eventually? So At the time, not much was known, but people that had experience in the field realized 3 or 4 or 5 years, and that's it, and that's already a killing. We don't like droughts, particularly if you're in the business of agriculture. And yet, in this case, it lasted 10 years. That kind of relates to the drought in the Sahel. Remember, I did mention that lasted 17 years. Those are anthropogenic. But eventually, nature realizes that she has to come back and fix it, and she did fix that. Before even the Soil Conservation Service had a way to do over there. More or less at the end of the droughts, they were already coming with a solution, but it had to be implemented. It will take time to implement. I think what happened was that the drought decided that after 10 years it had enough, or the people that had enough, and it went away. Long story. Droughts is a very fascinating and important subject. And it's all related, by the way. Droughts, floods, sediment, water, etc. It's all related. Biota on top of it, vegetation, and so forth. That is the reason why I decided to get into this general field, because I could not, I realized that you cannot just talk about water and be water expert and that's it. Eventually people are going to call you a dummy. That guy, the only thing that knows is water, but he doesn't realize that water is surrounded by a whole lot of other things. So I didn't want to be in that situation. That's why I got into all these fields that I'm talking about here today. Okay. So what happened was that the Camp Creek gully was formed, and you've seen the gully already, and you've seen its recovery. I've been able to document its recovery. It will take a long time for it to recover. We estimate maybe 60 to 100 years, but it will recover. It is already in the trend to recovery. How did they fix it? The BLM went in there. They decided that the problem was that the the few cattle, because they already had very few cattle, not as much as they had when the whole thing was overgrazed at the turn of the century. But the few cattle were drinking off the water, which was 10, 15 feet below ground, and they were trampling the area. And that was causing problems. Trampling means compacting so that the water cannot go through and it has to run on the surface and it exits the area. You would recall, those of you that have worked in construction, that there is such a thing in construction as part of the equipment or the machinery. There's a sheep foot roller, right? All of you remember or have heard about that. Sheep foot roller. It's a roller designed in the way of hundreds of sheep feet so that they can compact the soil. So you can see that the fact that the sheep compact and trample the soil is already incorporated, is the truth, and it is already incorporated in construction machinery. Okay. Byproduct of the Camp Creek fencing decision, so they decided to fence the 15 miles or whatever it was, on both sides, of course. They wouldn't let any more cattle into the creek. And a byproduct has been the substantial increase in summer flows. Now they have summer flows. Before they didn't have summer flows. Where are the summer flows coming? From the bank, the stream bank. Okay? The presence of the exclosure resulting in the establishment of riparian vegetation. Here's the good old riparian vegetation coming up again. Net bank building, channel aggradation. Yes, channel aggradation. We were there on the period of 15 years, 1989, 2004, and we were able to document roughly 2 feet of aggradation on what had been more like 20, 25 feet. So it's positive. It's slow, but it's positive. Why couldn't they fix it all together? Fill up the sediment in the creek and fix it. You can't, because that would be too costly. Nobody's willing to pay the money to do that. They will have to wait until it happens, which will be a while. Okay, so I'm going to stop in there. The Sheep Creek Barrier Dam had to do with a dam in Utah that was designed to stop the sediment. And it did stop the sediment. In a couple of years, it got full of sediment. And throughout the later years, it continued to fill up with sediment. More so, in other words, If they figured out that, say, 100 units of sediment were going to be held by the dam, 100 units were held in the next couple of years, and then after that it continued to increase. And I haven't been there recently. I was there 30 years ago, but by the time we looked at this 30 years later, it was already doubling the amount of sediment. Why? Because sediment has shear. It's not like water. If you hold water behind the dam, it will find its level and stay there. Sediment doesn't find its level. So sediment continues to build up upstream. You can see it. It's almost like a sledge, or I'm not a sledge, but a triangle of sediment deposits above the dam location. So Sheep Creek Barrier turned out to be a success in terms of controlling the sediments. Why did they want to control the sediments at that point? Because they had a lot of sediments coming down, and they felt that they didn't want them to get into the Colorado River, which was downstream, because for protection of the dams that had been built on the Colorado. See, it's always a fight, and you can never win this fight, by the way. Welcome to the real world. We will never win the fight with the sediments. We will ameliorate, we can solve temporarily things, but not forever, because the sediment is always going to move. It is in its nature. And it's not necessarily a bad thing that the sediment move. It's just we have a tendency to look at it from the point of view of people. In some places it is bad, in some other places it is not bad. A case in point, when they had the flood in the Mississippi in the year 2011, I was there and I did a video. They deviated the water and they sent it to the reservoir that was supposed to hold on to the sediments, but they had to flood the land, the farmland, and the people that were renting, actually they were leasing the farms, complained that the Army Corps had flooded them purposely, which is correct, because they were flooding people that were leasing the land. They were not owners of the land. But they didn't realize, or they could not realize, or would not realize, that that was good for them, because the next couple of years, well, all that sediment was going to get into production, and it was going to give them better crops. So good sediment, bad sediment, that's true. Sediment could be both good and bad, depending on how you look at it. There was a gentleman working out of Germany. His name is Professor Junk, J-U-N-K, who wrote a paper in 1989 talking about good sediment and bad sediment. I believe that's the title that he used in his paper. Fascinating paper by Professor Junk out of Germany. Alkali Creek, the Forest Service went into Alkali Creek. There was a lot of sediment, mostly not sediment. There was a lot of sediment because there had been an overgrazing in there again. Overgrazing was the culprit. So the Forest Service went in there and built 132 or 133 small check dams. There it is. In 1963, the Forest Service constructed 133 check dams. And they fixed the problem. After a few years, the whole thing died, and now it's completely fixed. I actually visited Alkali Creek in 1989 and took a lot of pictures and was able to verify that the Forest Service has done its job in controlling the sediment movement in Alkali Creek. A similar situation, perhaps more important situation at Trout Creek, also in Colorado. In this case, I believe it was the Forest Service too, but they were helped by the Civilian Conservation Corps. It was established in 1933 by President Franklin Roosevelt to try to insert some activity, let's put it that way, into the economy so that the United States would get out of the Depression. And he successfully did that, by the way. It took a few years, but he did that. The depression of 1929 and 32 was gone by 1935. How many dams were built? On the order of, somewhere in here we say, well, there's a whole lot of dams. I don't know how many at this point, I don't remember. But that was also successful, very successful. Okay, so I am going to, those are the 4 projects, successful projects of baseflow augmentation that we documented in the year 1989, 1990. Now, I have for you in here the story of Oregon's Bear Creek. It's a pictorial written by Wayne Elmore, text and photos. Wayne Elmore at the time, my colleague, working out of the Bureau of Land Management at Prineville, Oregon. I was there, 1989, and then again in 2004. And he gave me these pictures and all these writings. I believe he gave me a magazine, and what I did, I scanned the magazine and put his own writing together so that I would show a project that he had been involved with, which was successful in restoring watersheds, controlling sediment movement, and improving aesthetics and so forth. The first one of these pictures was August 77. This is a time series of photographs. And I believe I already talked about that. May 83, August 86, June 87, August 87. And this is a project in which I believe Wayne Elmore was personally involved. And that's why he was able to publish this in Range magazine, the spring of 1988. Look at this. In 1977, the stream was bad. Stream vegetation low in diversity, stream banks actively eroding. The stream bank over here actively eroding. Vertical banks. Channel was deeply incised and high flows contained moderate to high sediment loads. In other words, the water was dirty. Stream flow in the summer was intermittent, meaning there was no base flow. Intermittent stream flow, that means there's situations or times where there is no base flow. The base flow dries out. That means the groundwater goes below the base level of the stream. Number 2, banks are healing and channel is narrowing. Now the banks are healing. Can you see the healing over here? The time photographs over here, vertical bank. Here the bank is not that vertical anymore. Sediment is being trapped by the vegetation. Can be seen on the banks. Junipers in the foreground. I was looking at it this morning. I didn't see the junipers. I think he's referring about this in the back. Anyway, we're cut to release upland vegetation. Over here, number 3, channel has narrowed considerably. Where's the channel? I don't see it anymore. It is there. You can see the little amount of water in here. Considerably, nearly 1.5 feet of sediment has been trapped on the floodplain over here. Already trapped on the floodplain over here. Existing vegetation will carry over to filter sediment and reduce stream energies for bank protection. So the water is coming out a little clearer because it is being filtered by the sediment. Number 4, vegetation along the banks filters sediment from a summer flood event. The raising of the floodplain also caused the channel to widen over here. It must be over here during the summer flood. And finally, 2 months after the previous photo, vegetation is seen growing up through the newly deposited sediment, stabilizing it on the floodplain. Now it's a narrow channel and with clear water. Can you believe that? Well, over here, the water is much wider channel, at least 3 or 4 times. Successful project carried out by our colleague Wayne Elmore from the Bureau of Land Management in the middle 80s and I believe 80s. Red Clover Creek, past and present. In here we have a vector, which I believe is this, right? And then we have a raster. I'm going to show you the raster first. I should say at this point that back in the year 2009, I was invited by this gentleman over here, I believe his name is Jim Wilcox, to go to the celebration. It was a 25-year celebration of his institution that he managed he headed over it in Plumas. I believe the name is Plumas. I could be wrong. It's been 30 years, so 25 years. So let's just get started on the video, and I will find it necessary maybe to stop it every once in a while. This video is called The Story of Red Clover Creek, Plumas County. Plumas County is one of the 58 counties in California. I'm not sure, maybe you guys never been out there. It's about, in order to get to the town, the seat of county government at Plumas County, it's about 6 hours north of, should I say San Francisco? I think so. 6 hours north of, at least Sacramento. I think I flew to Sacramento and then rented a car. Right there, Google Earth tells us where exactly is Red Clover Creek. Red Clover Creek was a relatively shallow stream with permanent baseflow and supporting an excellent fishery. In the late 1940s and early 50s, federal programs were introduced to eliminate willows using aerial herbicide spraying. What? The willows are the riparian vegetation. But the federal programs at the time, presumably, didn't know anything about riparian vegetation. I already told you that it was in 1989 that the Bureau of Land Management saw fit to change the job description of our friend Wayne Elmore, and he began to be called riparian specialist, 1989. So we're talking here 1940s and 1950. The federal government was unaware of these things, and they were actually doing the wrong things. Aerial herbicide spraying? Herbicide is a product of society that kills plants. Should we be in the business of killing plants? And the answer is, if you're going to do it with extreme care. Don't do it wholesale because it's going to backfire. We have known that for a long time now. At about the same time, over 300 beaver were removed from the system. The beaver were there doing their work. What do beavers do? They protect themselves from predators by building dams. And because they are amphibious, they hide in the water. They're typical mammals cannot really pursue them below water. So that's how they hide. So why do beavers build dams? Because the dams produce a reservoir and then they hide in the reservoir. They can build their tunnels, and by tunneling they can tunnel throughout the neighborhood and hide and build their dens within the neighborhood of the surface water and groundwater created by the dam. The actions, together with the long-standing effects of heavy grazing. Heavy grazing? Yes. We have had a tendency in the last 100 years to abuse, by over-agriculture, overgrazing, the fields, the rural areas, in California as well as elsewhere in the United States. There's a lot more control now because we realize that all these issues could and eventually will backfire. So we got to be careful. The important issue is sustainability. Can this system be sustained for the future? And the future means the future, meaning the future of our kids and our grandkids, much more than 1 or 2 generations. So the future should be forever, although forever is a very strong word, but so be it. Logging railroad grades. Have we been logging out there? Yes, we log, meaning get the wood out, because we have a practice in society, U.S. society, of building our houses out of wood. We got to go find the wood somewhere, right? Typically in the forest. So logging will continue. Nowadays, better managed. My understanding is that it is better managed, but you know what? I'm not an expert in that field, so I'm not going to comment too much on it. The 1955 flood was the catalyst for the massive gully formation through the valley, which continued through most of the 1980s. Flood, 1955. What is a flood? A flood is a situation that carries a whole lot of water and destroys a whole lot of property, all kinds of property. Why do they happen? Mother Nature wants to put floods together. Usually, the flood drought sequence is one that has to be reckoned. If there's a flood, a year or two typically will be followed by a drought. And then what follows the drought is another flood, and another flood, and another drought, and so forth. Our issue is to figure out what the frequency and perhaps duration and intensity, duration, frequency. Your professor has a conceptual model of IDF for droughts, but I've studied floods for more than 15 years, more. So I consider myself also a flood expert. Back in the middle 70s, when I was a student at Colorado State, my professor got a project to study flood damages. They wanted to document the amount of flood damages because somebody had said that even though we were spending a whole money on floods, the flood damages were not decreasing. They were increasing, as a matter of fact. So it seemed counterproductive to spend a whole lot of money when the damages were not decreasing. So it took about a year for us to document the flood damages throughout the United States. I must have the report somewhere. I haven't seen it in a number of years. It was one of my first reports because I think I was in charge of writing that report. It was a 300-page report on flood damages. So we know about floods and we know about droughts. So a flood will come eventually. So we have to be prepared. A case in point, what's happening today in Pakistan. You can call it whatever you want to call it. I don't want to mention names at this point, but Pakistan is, as we speak, is being subjected to tremendous amount of flooding. The southern part of Pakistan. Pakistan is a relatively big country. The southern part is immersed in water as we speak, and the whole world is trying to help out. I believe there's 2,000-3,000 people that have already been drowned by this particular flood. Terrible situation, but it's not the last one, nor is the first. It will continue to happen. We will try to fight it. We will try to do whatever is necessary to survive the flood, but the floods will be there no matter what. As a matter of fact, I say this, I said this when I was teaching my hydrology. Hydrology many years ago, if you see a piece of flat land, and there's many out there, I mean, just look at LA. Some of you were in LA. LA is a complete flat land. You can't see a hill anywhere. Well, that's an exaggeration, but not like San Diego. I live up here in North County. It's all full of hills, but not the Southern County or the South County. You see, but the point I'm making is that if you see flat land, it was formed by floods. It was formed by floods. When? Maybe 2-3 million years ago, but it was formed by floods. So without floods, you would not have flat land. And somehow, flat land is something that we have grown accustomed to building our cities in plain terrain, flatlands, you know. So let's keep going in here. Once the gullies were formed, the regional water table dropped. Right, the gullies bring the dropping of the regional water table. Baseflow was lost and erosion and sediment transport ensued. Once you drop the water table, then you have intermittent rivers or streams and sediment transport, erosion and sediment transport. Of all the reasons for the formation of the Feather River Coordinated Resource Management Group in 1985, none was more important than the loss of Red Clover Creek. So once they lost Red Clover Creek as a nice stream, in 20-30 years, it got destroyed by typically bad management coupled with a little bit of bad luck. Bad luck is always there, bad luck or good luck. But management, when you put together bad management and bad luck, then you get a disaster, which is what they got at Red Clover. Fortunately, though, they had a lot of people with good foresight, and they created this Feather River Coordinated Resource Management Group in 1985. Donna Lindquist, who gave me the contract in 1989, was one of the organizers, the leading initial, I guess you could say, people that formed the management group in Plumas County, 1985.
Hi, I'm Donna Lim.
That is Donna in the year 2004. She's the lady, the range scientist that in 1989 gave me the contract. And my association with those people continues, by the way, after 30 years of work.
I was one of the team members that helped put together the Red Clover Valley demonstration project in 1985.
It was a demonstration project. What is a demonstration project? It's a project to show the goodness of a certain idea.
You can see in the background here is the largest check dam we put on.
She was responsible for putting together 4 check dams on the river. This is a fascinating story, by the way. Let's keep going.
This channel, there's 4 check dams altogether. This was the most upstream check dam. It was about 9 feet in height.
What is a check dam? It's a whole bunch of rocks that cannot be carried by the water. They're big enough to not to be carried by this particular water, given the slope, and they will stay there. So these dams were put together in here in the middle 80s by this lady, Donna, and her team.
When it was first put in, now you can see it's overgrown with willows. There's a lot of sediment deposition.
That's a view of the number 4 dam, check dam. In order to design this dam, they had to put in their big rocks. They would consider the issues that we have been studying. How is the energy to move a certain type of material? And they would design these dams. They've been there for 30 years, so they must be correctly built.
The first dam downstream.
This is Dan Kafer, and the interesting thing about this gentleman is that he works for the Natural Resources Conservation Service, our great agency. However, its predecessor, the Soil Conservation Service, they were the ones that were responsible for the aerial herbicide spraying that I have been talking about. So I guess the conclusion would be that everybody can make a mistake.
It was like 3 feet tall, and it was in the bedrock. Bill, was there during its construction. And the next dam raises the water 6 feet, and then this one this one 9 feet, so that you have pond to pond to pond downstream, and you start with the bedrock control point upstream to create this dam that then backs water up for half a mile and recharges the whole watershed. And if you look out in the meadow, you can see the piezometer wells that Don Lindquist here in the mid-80s was monitoring what was happening with the groundwater and how it was recharging the groundwater out away from the stream bed.
This project gave Donna Lindquist the idea of creating the baseflow project that I carried out in the late 80s and early 90s. This particular project over here.
And recreating the meadow situation out here and improving water quality and creating wildlife habitat and all the great.
Unfortunately, I apologize for the poor quality. It was one of our first videos about 10 years ago.
Stuff that happened.
We do better, much better now.
Particular location.
This is very fascinating because in 1995, 10 years after Donna had got in, another group took the management and they decided that it was too slow. The project was okay, it was working, but it was too slow. And they wanted something faster. Wanted something faster? How was that? Well, this whole valley, or very large portions of this valley, is being owned by a rancher, cattle rancher. So he asked and petitioned the group to consider doing something faster. Otherwise, he would have said, I wasn't there, but I could have said, I'm going to die before this thing ever happens, right? So they decided to get creative, and they decided to develop a new technology, which they called pond and plug. Now, I'm not quite sure exactly what happened there. I don't know everything. But they created this technology in 1995. But it was only in the year 2005 that they began to see success. Pond and plug seeks to eliminate the gully through on-site excavation and fill, forcing the water level in the valley to rise to meet the historic remnant. In other words, They were not doing 4 check dams, they were doing 25, 30 check dams, many check dams. In 2006, that's what I don't know exactly why it took them so long to do this. But in 2006, because I was there in 2010, and they told me everything about it, the success of the project. The pond and plug technique was used on additional portions of Red Clover Creek, downstream of the original check dam project. And now it looks like this. Look at that. It looks like this. That is really amazing. That's fixed completely. The water level has gone up about 14 feet.
Scott,
That's Jim Wilcox, head of the Feather River Coordinated Resource Management. He is the gentleman that I've been dealing with, and he invited me to this meeting in the year 2010, 12 years ago. And that's when I took the opportunity to take this video.
father-in-law George asked us to come out and take a look at things because something was happening, and that was that the check dams were actually kicking flood water out onto the valley, which was a good thing, but a lot of flood water was heading over where the cattle are, and
He's talking about something fascinating. He's saying that check dams were working, but they did not account or had no way of accounting for the morphology of the valley, which was carrying the water somewhere else where it was not wanted. So you have to look not only on the river itself or the stream itself, but also the valley, because new streams could be created by modifications to the flow.
There's actually an old remnant channel, probably maybe from Dixie Creek, a tributary that ran down that side.
Old remnant channel? What is he talking about? Well, this is a river that meandered all over that plain. So there's old remnant channels everywhere. Don't forget that this plain could be 3 million years.
Of the valley, and so it was focusing the flow in that channel, and then
this you can see flatland surrounded by hills and mountains. Yes, it's in the middle of the Sierras, but it's still a valley. And the valley was formed by floods. I already said that. It bears repeating.
McReynolds Creek took off to the north, and that's on your map. That's all was also treated in this project. And it was a gully, so when that water, that flood water was captured by the remnant channel and hit the McReynolds Creek gully, it began head cutting back up that side of the valley. So in essence, it was 800 feet away. This project was at risk of being end run. The old gully was right here, and then it cut across to the other side of the valley. So where that fence cuts back to the right on dry soil, that's a plug.
Basically, he's saying that they were at risk of losing the water of the river going somewhere else, aided by them, without really wanting or knowing.
That was the first plug on the main stem of Red Clover. The ponds and plugs you see in the background are the treatment of the McReynolds Creek gully, and that extends all the way to the base of that cone-shaped knoll there. And then the Red Clover gully continued on around the far side of the valley. So we have a plug there, another borrow site, which is a pond.
Unfortunately, this is a bit confusing for you and for me. We didn't have at that time drones or the support of drones that could have allowed us to have a clearer picture of what Jim Wilcox was saying. But believe me, he knew what he was talking. He had been working there for 10, 15 years.
Then another plug, so on. This channel here in the foreground was here, the remnant channel, and by basically eliminating the gully as a conduit for flow out of the valley, that caused the shallow groundwater and surface water to begin to rise. The next low spot to convey flow was the old channel. So we didn't have to do anything to the channel. We didn't have to build any channel. All we had to do was allow the water to find it.
And here comes Professor Ponce.
How much higher is the flow running over here now that the system is working?
I'm asking how much higher is the flow now?
Victor brought up a good point, and I actually don't have, I
probably should, for this kind of a presentation, to have a picture of the gully right over there. If we were out here pre-project, the water that would be running here would actually be running 14 feet lower than it is now. That's how much the water table has risen.
So they raised 14 feet in a few years. That is amazing. Camp Creek could not have done that in all the years that they have been operating, because Camp Creek, they weren't active. The people out there weren't active in fixing it. I don't know the politics, but I know that here the people wanted to fix it and they fixed it.
We had a 14-foot deep gully out there, about 100 feet wide. And it was pretty barren.
The meadow is well on its way to recovery. That's what the owner wants, the meadow to recover so that he can have food for his cattle.
This is quite a sight here in the vicinity of Red Clover Creek. What you see in here is the water table. The depth of the water table is about a foot or a foot and a half in here. This would not have been the case 20 to 25 years ago when this project was started. If you notice over here, right next to the pool, we've got this grass in here. And the grass is there.
There's the grass right next to the pool.
And as we move uphill, so to speak here, uphill we reach a gradient.
Reach a gradient and then the sagebrush. Can you see that? Grass in the forefront and in the background the sagebrush. Why is that? Because it is too wet in the front. The sagebrush can't get over there. Through adaptation, sagebrush doesn't like too much water, while grasses do. So they separate. They go where the water is, the level of the water is controlling the biota in there.
And pretty soon you start seeing sagebrush.
The cattle don't like to eat sagebrush, by the way.
Well, the sagebrush does not like a lot of water. So do you are positive then that this kind of technology for stream and creek restoration would benefit your project?
Absolutely. This is the most progressive work of this kind that I've ever seen. It's basically step by step undoing the steps that led to the erosion and dewatering of the water table of this entire meadow system, water-based system. So this is an opportunity for people that are interested in hydrology and engineering and environmental restoration to really see 25 years worth of work and the results of it.
So I am actually, let me get back in here. So as you can see, this project is a great project, and I'm actually very happy that I had a chance to participate. Luck again. I keep repeating this issue of luck. Luck has been the issue all my life. I lucked out that at that time there were no candidates, nobody else was interested in baseball at the time, and I got the job. And since then, for the last 30 years, I've been connected with these people that have done an excellent job in recovering Red Clover Creek. They are actually very popular around the world. Jim Wilcox told me that he's been being called around the world to show people how they did it. So perhaps they can reproduce it out there. I'm going to specifically cover the Soil Conservation Service initial work, initial research piece, dated 1940, on the influence of vegetation and watershed treatments on erosion, watershed erosion, very important subject.